January 17, 1945. Somewhere over the frozen earth of Normandy, the German reconnaissance pilot squinted through the fractured glass of his Focke-Wulf 190, its engine coughing black smoke into the winter sky. Below him, stretched across the Norman countryside like a scar upon the land, lay the American airfield at A-29 St. James. 3 days prior, his squadron had pummeled it with everything they had, 500-pound bombs cratering the runway, incendiaries turning fuel depots into columns of flame that could be seen from Cannes. He had watched through his gun sight as the concrete buckled and split, as American fighters scattered like startled birds, as the entire operational heart of the base seemed to collapse into chaos and ruin. His flight leader had radioed back to command. The airfield was destroyed, unusable, removed from the war for weeks, if not months. But now, as his damaged aircraft limped homeward through hostile skies, the pilot looked down and felt something cold and unfamiliar settle into his chest. Something that had nothing to do with the wound in his shoulder or the failing hydraulics of his plane. The airfield was alive. Thunderbolts and Mustangs lined the repaired runway in perfect rows, their propellers spinning, their wings catching the pale winter sun. Supply trucks moved in organized columns along freshly graded service roads. The craters, those massive wounds his bombs had torn into the earth just 72 hours before, had vanished, filled and paved over as if they had never existed. He blinked, certain his blood loss was causing hallucinations. But the scene below remained unchanged, impossibly real. The Americans had not retreated. They had not abandoned the base. They had simply erased the damage and continued their war. He would not make it back to German lines. His plane would come apart over occupied France, and he would spend the remainder of the war in a prisoner compound in Belgium, telling a story that his fellow captives would struggle to believe. But in that moment, suspended between sky and earth, between the ideology he had been raised to worship and the reality unfolding beneath him, he understood something that would haunt the Wehrmacht for the remainder of the war. They were not losing to better soldiers or superior tactics. They were losing to a nation that could rebuild faster than Germany could destroy. This was not supposed to happen. Not according to everything the German military had calculated, everything their intelligence had predicted, everything their doctrine had prepared them for. War, as the Wehrmacht understood it, was a contest of will and resource attrition. You struck the enemy's infrastructure, severed his supply lines, destroyed his ability to project force, and he withdrew, regrouped, rebuilt over weeks or months while you pressed your advantage. This was the pattern that had held true across Poland, France, the Low Countries, the Balkans, the Blitzkrieg philosophy that had carried the Third Reich to the doorstep of Moscow and the shores of the Mediterranean. But Normandy had become something else entirely, something the German military mind had no framework to comprehend. The Americans were rebuilding their airfields faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy them, sometimes restoring full operational capacity within hours of an attack. It was logistically impossible. It defied every principle of military engineering. And yet it kept happening, base after base, crater after crater, until the sheer impossibility of it became the new reality of the Western Front. The story of this phenomenon, this almost supernatural capacity for rapid repair, begins not in Normandy, but in the doctrinal halls of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, in the minds of men who understood that the Second World War would not be won by heroism alone, but by the unglamorous mathematics of logistics, by the ability to move earth and lay concrete faster than any nation in history had managed. They had studied the lessons of the Great War, where static positions and broken supply lines had turned Europe into a cemetery. They had watched the early years of this new conflict, observing how the German war machine had learned to strike hard and fast, to cripple infrastructure before the enemy could respond. And they had asked themselves a question that would reshape the nature of mechanized warfare. What if the enemy's advantage could be nullified not by preventing damage, but by making damage irrelevant? What if an airfield could be designed not just to withstand attack, but to absorb it, to metabolize destruction, and emerge operational before the attacking aircraft had even returned to their bases? The answer came in the form of innovation so practical, so rooted in American industrial culture, that it seemed almost mundane. But mundane was exactly what won wars in the 20th century. The U.S. military developed specialized engineering battalions, aviation engineer battalions to be precise, trained specifically in rapid airfield repair. These were not ordinary construction units. They were mobile industrial operations, each battalion equipped with massive earth-moving machinery that had been adapted from civilian mining and construction equipment. Caterpillar bulldozers, Lou Tourneau scrapers, Euclid dump trucks, equipment so powerful it could move more earth in an hour than a company of men with shovels could move in a week. They traveled with their own asphalt plants, portable concrete mixers, compaction rollers, grading equipment, lighting systems for night work, and most crucially, a supply chain so efficient it could deliver thousands of tons of crushed stone, steel matting, and asphalt to a forward position within hours of a request. But machinery alone was not the secret. The true innovation lay in the doctrine, the systematized approach to damage assessment and repair that turned chaos into choreography. When a German bomb cratered a runway, American engineers did not simply fill the hole and hope for structural integrity. They had calculated the precise load-bearing requirements for different aircraft types. AP-47 Thunderbolt required different foundation strength than AB-17 Flying Fortress, and developed rapid-setting materials that could achieve those specifications under field conditions. They used pierced steel planking, interlocking metal sheets that could be laid directly over compacted earth to create an instant runway surface capable of handling fully loaded combat aircraft. They pioneered the use of quick-setting concrete mixtures that cured in hours rather than days, incorporating chemical accelerators that had been refined in American industrial laboratories. They divided airfields into operational zones so that damage to one section never compromised the entire facility. And most importantly, they rehearsed endlessly until every man in an aviation engineer battalion could perform his role in pitch darkness, under artillery fire, in the chaos of active combat. The German soldiers who encountered this system, first as enemies trying to destroy it, later as prisoners witnessing it from behind barbed wire, struggled to reconcile it with their understanding of military operations. In the Wehrmacht, engineering work was serious, methodical, performed by specialists with careful attention to technical specifications. It took time because it required precision. The idea that a cratered runway could be operationally repaired in 6 hours, or that an entire forward airfield could be constructed from nothing in under a week, seemed to violate the laws of physics and labor. German military doctrine allocated weeks for airfield construction, days for significant repairs. Their engineering manuals specified curing times for concrete that could not be rushed without compromising structural integrity. They had calculated the labor hours required for excavation and grading based on available manpower and equipment. And by every metric in those manuals, what the Americans were doing was impossible. Yet the reports kept coming in from the front. A Luftwaffe bombing raid on the airfield at A-31 Gale, executed with precision on August 12, 1944. Direct hits on the primary runway, secondary taxiways damaged, fuel storage destroyed. The attack commander filed his report with confidence, target neutralized, estimate 3 weeks before restoration to operational status. Reconnaissance flights the following morning revealed American aircraft taking off from the same runway, the craters filled and surfaced, ground crews refueling fighters as if nothing had happened. 13 hours. That was how long it had taken. 13 hours to erase an attack that should have crippled the base for weeks. Or the incident at A-27 Rennes, where a nighttime bombing raid by He-111s had torn the southern third of the runway into rubble. German intelligence predicted a minimum 10-day repair window. The Americans had P-51s flying combat missions from that runway 31 hours after the attack. The craters had been filled with a combination of crushed stone and compacted earth, topped with pierced steel matting that created a surface actually superior to the original asphalt in terms of drainage and flexibility. The American Engineering Battalion had worked in rotating shifts through the night, under portable lighting systems powered by diesel generators, while anti-aircraft batteries maintained a defensive perimeter and construction continued despite the threat of follow-up attacks. For the Luftwaffe pilots and ground commanders receiving these reports, the psychological impact was profound and corrosive. Imagine training for years in the doctrine of strategic bombing, in the careful calculation of target prioritization, in the understanding that certain strikes, if executed properly, could remove enemy assets from the battlefield for extended periods. Imagine risking your life, watching your comrades die in flak-filled skies, pressing through fighter opposition to deliver your payload precisely on target, achieving textbook perfect hits, and then learning that your success had been erased before you had even landed. The futility of it gnawed at morale in ways that direct combat losses did not. A pilot could accept dying in a dogfight, could understand losing to superior numbers or tactics. But dying to achieve nothing, to strike a blow that would be undone before the sun rose again, was a unique form of psychological warfare. The Americans, for their part, understood exactly what they were doing. This was not accidental. The rapid repair capacity was as much a weapon as the fighters it kept operational, a deliberate strategy to impose a specific kind of despair on the enemy. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, in his communications with the War Department, explicitly noted the morale impact of airfield resilience on German forces. Intelligence reports from interrogated prisoners consistently mentioned the psychological effect of watching American bases recover from attacks that should have crippled them. One captured Luftwaffe major, when asked about his experiences over Normandy, spoke not about American fighters or anti-aircraft fire, but about the airfields, describing them with a kind of haunted disbelief. You could bomb them to pieces, and they would be whole again by morning. It was like fighting something that could not be killed. The symbolic weight of this, the unkillable airfield, carried implications that extended far beyond military logistics. 4 German soldiers raised in totalitarian state where resources were rationed, where every nail and board was accounted for, where the home front had been stripped to feed the war machine, the abundance displayed in American engineering operations was incomprehensible. They watched supply convoys arrive at forward bases with more equipment than many German divisions possessed in total. They saw Americans discard machinery that would have been carefully repaired and reused in the Wehrmacht. They witnessed waste on a scale that seemed obscene, bulldozers left running while operators took meal breaks, asphalt poured in quantities that exceeded minimum specifications simply because more was available, entire stockpiles of steel matting accumulated at supply depots because production outpaced consumption. This was the physical manifestation of American industrial capacity, the visible proof that the United States was fighting a different kind of war, one where material abundance was itself a strategic asset. The Soviet Union could match Germany in scale and sacrifice, could feed millions into the meat grinder of the Eastern Front, and continue advancing through sheer human mass. But the Americans fought with machines, with logistics, with an industrial base so vast that it could afford to be wasteful, could afford to over-engineer solutions, could afford to bring the productive capacity of an entire continent to bear on problems that other nations solve with blood and attrition. A German engineer looked at a bombed airfield and calculated the minimum resources required to restore minimal functionality. An American engineer looked at the same crater and asked not what was necessary, but what was possible with unlimited supply. The aviation engineer battalions embodied this philosophy. Consider the 826th Engineer Aviation Battalion, which landed in Normandy on June 12, 1944, 6 days after D-Day, and immediately began constructing advanced landing grounds in territory that was still within range of German artillery. They built A1 at Saint-Pierre-du-Mont in 7 days, carving a 5,000-foot runway out of Norman farmland using bulldozers, scrapers, and graders operating in round-the-clock shifts. When German bombers hit the airfield 4 days later, creating 11 craters across the primary runway and destroying a fuel dump, the battalion had all damage repaired and operational capacity restored in 9 hours. 9 hours to undo what the Luftwaffe had spent a week planning and a night executing. Or examine the work of the 819th Engineer Aviation Battalion at A-29 St. James, the airfield that German reconnaissance pilot had witnessed in disbelief. Records from the battalion's operations log detail the repair procedure with almost clinical precision. The attack occurred at 0200 hours on January 14, 1945. 5 bombs impacted the runway, creating craters ranging from 20 to 45 feet in diameter and up to 12 feet deep. A fuel line was severed. This was the lesson of Normandy, the teaching of those impossible repairs, that freedom, for all its apparent inefficiencies, possessed hidden strengths that tyranny lacked. That a society which trusted its workers, fed its soldiers, supplied its bases with abundance rather than calculating scarcity, which rewarded initiative, and adapted doctrine to reality rather than forcing reality to conform to doctrine, such a society could accomplish what appeared impossible to more rigidly controlled systems. The filled craters were more than engineering achievements. They were arguments, demonstrations, proofs written in the language of logistics and material that the American system, messy and wasteful as it often appeared, could mobilize resources and organize effort on a scale that made ideology irrelevant and made victory inevitable. That was what the German pilot saw when he looked down at the airfield that should have been destroyed. That was what broke in him during those months of captivity. Not his courage or his will, but his certainty, the ideological confidence that had sustained him through years of war, the belief that discipline and sacrifice and martial virtue would overcome material disadvantage. The runways taught him otherwise. The Americans had discipline enough, sacrifice enough, virtue enough. But they also had bulldozers in reserve, steel planking by the ton, concrete that cured in hours instead of days, engineers who worked through the night, a supply system that treated his greatest military effort as a minor disruption to be resolved by morning. In the end, that was the story written across the airfields of Normandy and beyond, that the war would not be won by the side that struck hardest, but by the side that could rebuild fastest, that persistence was a function of supply as much as spirit, that the unglamorous work of logistics and engineering determined outcomes more surely than battlefield heroics. The aviation engineer battalions, with their bulldozers and scrapers and portable asphalt plants and pierced steel planking, were the visible embodiment of American industrial power applied to war. They did not storm beaches or take hills. They filled craters. They laid runways. They kept the aircraft flying, and the supply lines moving, and the war machine advancing. And in doing so, they achieved a victory so complete that the enemy could only watch in disbelief as his best efforts were erased, as the damage he inflicted was absorbed and overcome, as the bases he bombed repaired themselves and continued operations as if his desperate strikes had been nothing more than temporary weather. This is the truth that the German reconnaissance pilot learned in the skies over Normandy, a truth that would echo through every subsequent conflict of the industrial age, that material abundance, properly organized and ruthlessly applied, was itself a weapon of overwhelming power. That a nation capable of rebuilding faster than its enemies could destroy had achieved a kind of invulnerability, not to damage. The bombs still fell, the craters still opened, but to the consequences of damage, to the disruption and delay and demoralization that destruction was supposed to inflict. The Americans had learned to metabolize destruction, to treat it as raw material, to turn craters into fresh concrete and twisted steel into salvage and enemy attacks into opportunities to demonstrate their inexhaustible capacity for repair and renewal. And so the runways rose again, one after another, all across the Western Front, testaments to a kind of power that transcended military force, the power of organized industry, of systematic logistics, of a society mobilized and confident in its abundance. The Germans could bomb them. They did bomb them, repeatedly, desperately, until they ran out of fuel and aircraft and pilots. But they could never defeat them, because the runways were not really targets in the traditional sense. They were symbols, physical manifestations of an industrial and organizational capacity that could not be overwhelmed by conventional military means, that could only be exhausted by attacking its source. And that source lay across an ocean, protected and productive, churning out supplies and equipment and trained personnel faster than any force on Earth could consume them. That was the final lesson, the truth written in every repaired crater, that America had not come to Europe merely to fight a war, but to demonstrate a system, to prove that democratic capitalism could mobilize resources and organize effort more effectively than any totalitarian alternative, that abundance and freedom were not weaknesses but sources of strategic advantage, that the open society possessed depths of resilience that closed systems could not match. The filled runways were arguments in this demonstration, each one a small proof of a larger thesis, each repair a refutation of the ideology that had plunged Europe into darkness. The German pilot carried this knowledge with him for the rest of his life, a burden heavier than his wartime experiences, more profound than his military defeats. He had learned what every German soldier eventually learned one way or another, that they had been fighting not just an enemy, but a future, a way of organizing human society and productive capacity that made their own system obsolete. The runways told that story with brutal clarity. They could bomb them into rubble, and by morning the bombers would be taking off from smooth concrete again, as if the night's desperate effort had never happened, as if German resistance was nothing more than a speed bump on the road to an inevitable conclusion. This was the power that rebuilt Europe after the war, the same abundant industrial capacity that had filled the craters and paved the runways now turning to the work of reconstruction. The Marshall Plan, with its flood of American aid and equipment and expertise, was the peacetime expression of the same philosophy that had kept the airfields operational. That abundance, properly applied, could solve problems that scarcity made insoluble, that rebuilding could happen faster than anyone thought possible if you had enough resources and the will to deploy them. That the American system was not just militarily powerful, but economically productive on a scale that made generosity affordable and transformation achievable. The runways are silent now. But their lesson endures, written into the history of the 20th century, into the understanding of what makes nations powerful and societies resilient. The Americans did not just defeat Germany in the air, they demonstrated a model of organized abundance that would reshape the post-war world. And it all showed itself first in those impossible repairs, those craters filled by morning, those runways that refused to stay broken, small miracles of logistics and industry that announced to anyone watching that a new kind of power had arrived in Europe, one that measured strength not in ideological purity or martial tradition, but in bulldozers and steel planking and the sheer, overwhelming capacity to rebuild faster than the enemy could destroy.